So what do you do when you don't get what you want in the time that you want it? I mean, it seems like everything from going to a restaurant to dealing with people in relationships, oftentimes we find ourselves in situations where we don't get what we want in the time that we want it. We're going to begin a brand new series today called Ordinary Heroes. And what we're doing in this series is looking at the lives of some Old Testament characters, figures. One, because we want to learn about their lives, but the other reason is because what God did in their lives, we can learn from and draw application for in our lives today. And today I'm going to talk with you about this difficult topic of growing in our patience from the life of Abraham and Sarah. There's a lady years ago, one of the first churches that I pastored, her name was Carolyn Goetz, and Carolyn was a go-getter. She was a Martha type, if you're familiar with that type. She did not like idle hands or idle feet. And she would say to me often, she would say, Brian, I was absent the day that the Lord handed out patience. And I don't know if you can relate to that, but here's some definitions to kind of help you evaluate maybe where you are in terms of your ability to wait on God or your patience level. One definition is this. It's the quiet, uncomplaining endurance under stress or annoyance. Another is this. It's the capacity to tolerate or accept delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. How are we doing? Another is this. I thought this was good. Patience is defined as the willingness to move at someone else's pace rather than pressure him or her to match yours. When you think about patience, patience is not the same thing as passivity. It's not the same thing as being lazy or unmotivated or just wanting to lay back and kind of let life happen. Patience is when you want to see something happen. Like you've got a desire, you've got a yearning, you've got a longing. Patience is when you want to see something happening, but that thing is not happening in the time that you want it to happen. And so if I could just ask you this question, in your relationship to God, if you could evaluate your patience level, your ability to move at God's pace without pressuring God to match yours, what's your patience level? We all understand patience is a virtue. We know patience is a fruit of the Spirit. Paul tells us, Galatians 5. He tells us in 1 Corinthians 13:4, love is patient. He tells us, Romans 12:12, be patient in tribulation. The fact is, patience is hard because if you're a driven, motivated type person, you tend to view patience and waiting as wasting time. If you feel like you're not able to do something or you're not seeing progress happen, if there's nothing productive taking place, you can tend to equate waiting time as wasted time. And so the question is, how do we grow in our patience? How do we grow in our ability to wait on God? Because we all understand that sooner or later, God has a timeline and it is His own, and He's not concerned oftentimes about ours. And so that's what we want to talk about today from the life of Abraham and Sarah. Now, to introduce these two characters for you, if you can't imagine with me, men, that you're 75 years old, you are out one day, and you sense the voice of the Lord. You sense that He is speaking to you, and He is calling you, and His message is this: if you will leave everything that you know, depart from your current land, depart from most of the people who you've known and grown up with your friends. Go to this new foreign land where you're not going to know anybody. There aren't going to be churches like yours. There's going to be foreign religions. It's going to be foreign land. You're going to get to live in a tent. If you'll depart from the land that you're in and go to this new place, I'm going to give you children. In fact, I'm going to bless you and make you the father of nations. Now, you might wonder if you're 75 years old why you would want that, why you would want kids. I'm 44, I have a 14-month-old, and I realize why a lot of people have kids in their 20s. So you may struggle with that, but just imagine this happens to you and you obey. By faith, you say, I'm gonna believe the voice of the Lord, His promise to me. Now, wives, imagine this. Your husband, if you're married, your husband comes home one day and he says, guess what? I was out today and I just felt like I heard the voice of the Lord, and however it was that it transpired. And the husband comes home and says, look, what we need to do is we need to leave everything. We need to go to this place that, well, we don't really know much about it. The writer of Hebrews would say later that Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. We need to leave this place that is our familiarity and everything that we know, and we need to go to this distant place and live in tents. Now, imagine if you're 65 years old and your husband says this, and he says, here's the kicker. If you'll do this, God will bless you with children. And somehow, imagine being motivated as your husband comes home and you say yes in faith. You listen to the voice of the Lord and you go. That's where we find Abram and Sarai in Genesis chapter 12. Abram, at this point, receives this call, hears this voice from the Lord. In verse 1 of chapter 12 of Genesis, we read, now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. Notice the promises that God is making here. And make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So verse 4. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Notice this, now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So they say yes to the voice of the Lord. We're going to go, we're going to follow, we're going to be obedient in faith, we're going to trust you. But then they run into a problem. They go through the first month, they go through the first year, no child. And I don't know what the conversations might have been like between Abram and Sarai. I can picture Sarai saying, now Abram, you said God said. It's been a year and I still don't have a child. Maybe there were times where Abram was like, look, I'm trying. I'm doing my best. I'm doing everything I know to do. I don't know how to change the situation beyond what I'm doing right now. I don't know what their conversations were like, but I would imagine over the course of time, Abram starts wondering, did I really hear God say what he said? I did. I heard God say that. Will God be faithful to His promise? Can I continue to wait on God to be faithful to what He told me He would do? Well, the first year goes by, first 5 years. Eventually they get to a point after 10 years, Sarai comes up with an idea. She apparently is impatient, not that I can blame her one bit. After 10 years of waiting on this promise, she gets to be 75 years old. She still doesn't have a child, so she takes matters into her own hands. Because of her impatience, she says, God, I need to help you out. In Genesis 16, we read verses 1 through 3, her attempt to help God out. In verse 1, it says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, look at this idea. Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go to my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. What happens subsequently is a child is born from Hagar whose name is Ishmael. So they birth this Ishmael who would go on to become the father of Arab nations. And from that there would be great division if you know much about history. And there was this huge problem that was created because of their impatience, because of their inability to wait on God, they birthed this Ishmael. When I think about my own life, I think about oftentimes my lack of patience. A couple of months ago, I decided I was going to take all of the 3 kids to the Monster Truck Show, Mile High Stadium, and they had been looking forward to this forever, and so we got the tickets, got ready to roll, and we left about 45 minutes in advance of when I knew that we needed to be there. I gave myself a 45-minute window of cushion in time. So we leave in plenty enough time to get there. Well, we exit off of the interstate onto a road. Don't know what the road is, but on that road, we were looking over directly to our right, and there is Mile High Stadium. If you've never tried this, there are like 83 parking spots if you look on Google for Mile High Stadium. And so I knew we were going to head toward one of these parking spots. And so it looked like we were there already, but as we got on this road, we just stopped. And at the first, I'm thinking, not a big deal because I'm responsible, gave myself a 45-minute window. After the first 5 minutes, okay, and the kids start asking the questions, Dad, are we going to be late? Dad, what's wrong? Dad, why won't the cars move? Dad, why don't you go? Dad, why don't you go in the other lane? Dad, what, so like, moms, you get this all the time. You're like, oh, you poor guy. You hear this for, like, moms, we live this every day. I get it. But for me, I don't. And so we're going there, and there's Mile High Stadium off to the right, and we were there like in that half-mile section for over 30 minutes. And by the time, like, we had gotten to exit off, I didn't have any patience left. I was done waiting. And so we get off of this exit, and I can see up in the distance there's a place where it looks like people are parking. And so get closer, 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 and watching the clock, it's getting close to the time where this thing is starting. And as we get closer, I say, okay, people are parking there, and I'm thinking maybe they're going to do this pay for parking thing, which, just so you know, I'm from an area, rural, southeastern Oklahoma. To pay for parking, it's just almost immoral. It's like, just don't do that. Well, so we get up there, and I'm so frustrated. I visit with the guy, and he's like, yeah, you can park here. How much can you park? $20. $20 for 2 hours? Are you kidding me? Listen, at that point, I was so ready to birth an Ishmael, I would have paid $100 for the parking spot. I was so frustrated that I was ready to make a decision that was not wise. Because of my impatience and my desire to get out of that situation, I would have made a very unwise decision, an unwise choice. And here's, some of you, maybe you've lived this before. And some of you, if you could stand here today, you would say the same thing. But there may be others of you, you're tempted in a situation to say, I so want out of the situation I'm in now, and I want this new situation, that perhaps you would be tempted to birth an Ishmael. Perhaps you would be tempted to do something that is premature, to take a matter into your own hands, not trusting in God, not believing that God's going to provide, but you have to do this or else God's not going to provide. It could be in the area of, we see this all the time with debt and finances. One of the primary things that leads people into this sense of debt is that they birth these Ishmaels and they say, God, I have to have this now. Can't really afford it, but I have to have it now. A number of people who have birthed Ishmaels in their relationships. And again, some of you may have lived this, or some of you may be looking at this in your future saying, God, if I don't say yes or commit to this person or take advantage of this opportunity that's in front of me, God, you may not bring anyone else along. And what happens consequently is you take the issue into your own hands, not living out of faith in God, really driven by a measure of fear. You birth an Ishmael, and negative things always tend to happen after that. Well, for Abram and Sarai, that's exactly what happened. You fast forward through the story in Genesis 17. God comes to them multiple times and affirms to Abram his promise. And in Genesis 17, he changes their names from Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah. And you move through after they have birthed their Ishmael. In Genesis 21, finally find God fulfilling his promise to them. But here's what's significant is it took about 25 years. At the time when Abram first received this call and the promise, 75 years old, when the promise is finally fulfilled, he's 100. In Genesis 21, we read verses 1 through 3. It says, "Then the Lord took note of Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac." Now, I've got a punchline that I want to lead us to in just a moment, and it has to do with the name Isaac. I want to take you on a brief journey to show you how intimately aware God was of Abraham and Sarah's life all the way through this journey. That in the times where they perceived God's provision was lacking, God was intimately aware of everything that was going on in their life. And as we move toward this punchline, here's what I would like for you to take from this, is for you to know, if you're in a season of waiting and longing and wondering and being frustrated, God, where are you? When are you going to open up this door? When are you going to transition this circumstance? I'm tired of waiting. It's for you to know that God is intimately aware of every detail, every circumstance of your life. So this is a fun thing for me, and if you would join me in this journey, go back to Genesis 17, verse 15. It says, "Then God said to Abraham, 'As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her.'" I want you to see Abraham's response in verse 17. "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed." This is hilarious, God. You're going to do what? So in response to Abraham laughing, God says this in verse 19. "But God said, 'No, but Sarah your wife will bear you a son. You shall call his name,'" and here's the key name, "Isaac." So, Abraham laughs. God says, "You're going to name a son Isaac." Fast forward, Genesis 18. I want you to see not just Abraham's response, I want you to see Sarah's response. Verse 9. 3 men come along, presumably some kind of messengers from the Lord, angelic messengers, we're not exactly sure, but they come and reaffirm this promise, reaffirm God's word. And in verse 9, they said to Abraham, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "They're in the tent." Now, if you're in the tent for 20 plus years, you get Sarah's angst, right? So they're in the tent. He said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Notice Sarah's response, verse 12. Sarah laughed. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?" So, Abraham laughs. God says, "You're going to have a child named Isaac." Sarah laughs. "You're going to have a child named Isaac." Here's what's fascinating about this little tidbit of the story. You know the name of Isaac, what it means? It means laughter. It literally means he laughs. I think if Abraham and Sarah could be here today, after everything that they went through, or they could go home with you this afternoon, or have lunch with you, or sit down with you in your kitchen or your living room, and they could hear your story, and they could hear the frustration or the doubt or the whatever it is that's going on in your heart, the thing that you're waiting on God to do, but God, for whatever reason, has chosen not to do, against your own good judgment. God just hasn't done it. If they could hear every bit of your story, I think they would say something like this: "I hear you." In fact, we've been through the very same thing. We had to wait on God, not just for a year, not just for 5 or 10 years. And by the way, we made some mistakes along the way. We were presumptuous and we tried to help God out. We got impatient. We based our decisions out of fear, not out of faith. But here's what we found in the end. Even in those times when God's provision seemed to be lacking, friend, God was intimately aware of every detail of our lives. He saw to the point of our laughter. He was aware of everything that was stirring within us. And friends, here's what you need to know. For you, it might not be laughter. For you, it might be something else. But God sees your doubt. God sees your frustration. God sees your questions. God sees your resentment. God sees your fear. God sees your disappointment. God sees your confusion. God sees everything that's going on in your heart. And so what you need to know, even though right now it seems like His provision is lacking, and He's promised you that He'll provide for all of your needs according to His glorious riches in Christ Jesus, and it seems as if He's not fulfilling that. He's not changing the circumstances of your life. Here's what you need to know, friends. And this is the central truth that I want to give you today. It's this. It's that His promise is sufficient. Even when His provision seems lacking. You will hear, if you wait long enough, if you long for something, if you desire to see something happen that you believe is a need, sooner or later you will have the same temptation that Abraham and Sarah had, which is to birth an Ishmael. Which is to say, God, let me take matters into my own hands. Let me transform the situation. You obviously are disinterested or incapable. Don't know what your issue is. I'm not exactly sure. But let me go ahead and handle this for you. On the other side of impatience and haste, and some of you know this. You've lived this. It's a world of pain. It's a world of regret. It's a world of hurt and even greater frustration than you may currently be experiencing now. And to the extent that you believe that God's promise is sufficient for you, to that same extent, you can be patient and wait on Him. But as your confidence in His promise wanes, so your ability to wait and be patient will wane. And so the message, the lesson from Abraham and Sarah is take God at His word. If He's made you a promise, don't feel as if you have to be presumptuous or go and help Him out or do for Him what He's incapable of doing, but to simply wait and to trust in Him. And it leads to this question, how do we wait well? Again, I don't know where you are. You may be like Carolyn Goetz, the lady I mentioned earlier, that said, look, I was absent the day that God handed out patience. But if you want to grow in your ability to be patient, if you want to become a better waiter, three ways to wait well. The first is this, it's to live by faith, not by fear. Again, I think the core of what drove Sarah and Abraham was this sense that if we don't do this, it's never going to happen. There's a thing within sales and psychology of sales called perceived scarcity. You may not be familiar with the term, but if you've ever gone to buy a vehicle and the salesman said, this is the last white whatever on our lot. What they're doing is trying to create a sense of a perception of scarcity. And when you perceive that that's the only one that's left and you might miss out on that opportunity, fear drives you to say, okay, I want it. And for you, if you're at a place where you think, okay, if I don't do this, this fear begins to drive you to say, well, I may miss out entirely forever. There's some questions that you can ask yourself if you get ready to face a decision and you want to know, am I operating out of faith or am I operating out of fear? One question is this. Am I making this decision out of fear that if I don't grab hold of it, nothing better will come along? Now, you can make that decision with a person, with a relationship. You can make that decision with a job. You can make that decision with an investment opportunity. I mean, any number of things. You can make that decision. And if you're being driven by just fear, you need to stop and ask yourself, am I about to birth an Ishmael? Am I about to get ahead of the Lord? Am I about to take this into my own hands? Another question is this: to determine if you're living by faith versus fear, am I afraid to ask God what His will is in this issue? Are you willing to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven? Or is there something in you that says, I don't really want to pray that with sincerity? Because if I pray, God, whatever you want, is this really what you want? If it's not what you want, put a roadblock there, prevent this from happening, turn and shape my heart. If you're afraid to pray that prayer, there's an opportunity, there's a chance that you're operating out of fear versus faith. Another question that can be helpful for you to ask is this: am I avoiding seeking counsel from mature believers in case they disagree with me? Now, I'm good at this. If there's something that I want to do, it's a little bit questionable. You've probably done this too. Who are the people I know in my life who will support this decision? And I'm going to go get counsel from them. But for you, if you have a reluctance to talk with people who are mature, who scripturally sound, who can guide you and help you make a wise decision, if there's a reluctance to engage with those sorts of people, it may very well be that you're making a decision or about to make a decision out of fear, not faith, and perhaps birth an Ishmael. The second way that we can wait well is to view waiting as an opportunity to mature. This is the least fun thing I'm going to say during this entire sermon. I want to acknowledge that. But in the same way that you don't give a child everything that they want and expect them to grow up and mature, in the same way, we talk about having a sweet tooth. It's this desire for sweet things instantly. You can have a spiritual sweet tooth where you expect God to do whatever it is that you want in the time in which you want it. And so what we want from God oftentimes is for Him to work quickly and in really large, sweet ways. But eventually we figure this out. God often chooses not to work in quick ways and large ways and in sweet ways. Oftentimes it seems that God's work is very slow. It's very small. And at times it's even sour. It does not cater to our sweet tooth. Because in the same way that you have to help a child understand that they have to eat healthy things and consume healthy things, even if they don't want them, if they're going to mature and grow, friends, our Father God loves us enough at times to say to us, I'm not going to give you the instant thing, the quick thing, the sweet thing. I'm going to give you the thing that you need. And waiting, friends, for us, it's one of those things that at times we have to consume from a good Father who loves us in order to mature. And so as opposed to interpreting this time of waiting as a wasted time or a time where God doesn't care, realize that this may very well be a time where God would say to you, child, I do care very much. I just want you to eat your broccoli and your spinach. And there may be a time for dessert later, but right now is not that time. A third way to wait well is to simply worship. Is to worship while you wait. If you tend to see waiting time as wasted time, the most important thing that you can do in that vacuum, in that time where you're wondering, God, what is it that you're going to do? How are you going to prove yourself? How are you going to provide? It seems right now that I don't know if your promise is sufficient because your provision seems lacking. I don't see you working. I've waited 10 days and there's still no fruit. I've waited 2 years and there's still no fruit. I've waited a decade, God, and you're still not showing up. What do you do? What do when you don't get what you want in the time that you want it? Let me tell you, you worship. There is never a bad time to focus on God and respond to Him and His greatness. To take your eyes temporarily off of whatever circumstance you're going through in your life and whatever negative feelings you may have or pity or doubt or whatever. There's never a bad time to take your focus off yourself, to look to God and say, God, this is who you are. And you can do that on a Sunday morning as we gather corporately. But friends, you can do that through the course of your week. You can do that as you travel in the morning to work. You can worship by focusing on God and responding to Him and to His greatness. And when you worship, you remind yourself of the truth of who God is. You remind yourself that His promise, His faithfulness to you, His word to you, it is good. You can count on it. And even in those times when it seems as if His provision is lacking, you know that His promise is still sufficient. He's still faithful. It's been said, and I think wisely, that the only thing worse than waiting on God is wishing that you had. Listen, friends, you may think that on the other side of whatever it is that you're waiting on, if you'll take matters into your own hands, and if you're driven by haste or driven by impatience, you think that things are tough now, just wait. They can get so much more difficult, so much more challenging. And so I think we would be called today to wait upon the Lord, to trust in Him and in His promise, to know that it's sufficient, even when His provision seems lacking. Father, I thank You for the story of Abraham and Sarah. I thank You for the powerful lesson of patience and waiting upon You. I thank You that You were faithful to them, even through the birth of Ishmael. I thank You that You are faithful to us. And there may be some here today, I know this has been my story, that they've gotten ahead of You, they've taken matters into their own hands. I thank You that You are a gracious God who stays faithful to Your people. And so I just pray for every person this morning that they would know that Your promise is sufficient. That You see every intricate detail of their lives in the same way that You saw Abraham and Sarah's laughter. You see our grief, our longing, our mourning, our regret. You see everything that stirs within us. You are a trustworthy and a faithful God. Help us to anchor our lives in that, to wait on You.